everyone, and welcome to this call. This is a free event in which I am introducing the release of my new book, Transdimensional Spirituality, and I have some things I want to speak to you about in relationship to that book. It's also being released. Well, there's a 12-week program that will be starting in March to work with the book, and I wanted to do this call because I feel that the publication of this book is the fruition of about a 2-year cycle that I've been in, that I think is shifting the orientation of, or evolving the teaching work that I'm doing. And I wanted to be able to share that with you. And so, as I said, the book is called Transdimensional Spirituality. The reason this feels exciting to me and the reason I want to share it with all of you is because something happened, well, probably 3 years ago or so, where I started to feel restless, or I started to feel an opportunity for growth in terms of what I share and how I teach. And I can say very simply that my teaching from the beginning, I started teaching, I suppose, in the early 2000s, but then started teaching on my own about 10 years ago, 12 years ago, independent of my previous teacher. And during most of that time, the emphasis of my teaching work was on meditation and what I would characterize as the process of release. So it's the release of the limitations of the earthbound identity, the exclusive identification with this earthbound self as our only self. So we release that because we begin to realize that we are that, certainly, and we are more than that. And we start to feel a desire to experience all of who we are. This is, I think, a general way of describing how spiritual work begins. Most of us are living a normal, familiar human life, and for some amount of time, that feels satisfying, and we learn from our culture and from our peers and from our families. We learn what it means to be human, what the goals of being human should be, what will make you happy, what will make you fulfilled, what will make you satisfied. And you go along pursuing those things until, and this might happen earlier or later for different individuals, but until you realize, oh, this is not going to be enough, right? The initial spiritual pull is always a pull to more, a sense that everything you've been told to believe about what human life is about is not all there is. And some people reaching that point of feeling the desire for more, or recognizing that there's more, start to feel a desire to realize that more. And that's when a spiritual quest begins. And the first thing that we need to do is liberate ourselves from all of the identities that we have absorbed. And now we've absorbed them through life circumstances, we've absorbed them through our culture, we've absorbed them through, well, lots of ways, but we have taken on all kinds of identities. And identities generally are ideas about what is and is not possible. And we begin to feel, oh, these identities are limiting me. We start to feel a bit strangled by these identities that we have adopted, by the roles that we are playing. And we want to discover who we are beyond that, further than that. And so the initial phase of spiritual work is a kind of release, a liberation from the limitations of identity. And if we embark on a spiritual quest and we do practices and we pursue teachings, we will inevitably begin to have tastes of who we are beyond identity. And what we taste is magnificent. It's glorious. It captures the imagination in ways that we couldn't have imagined. We could never, that when you start to discover the reality of who you are beyond the limits of identity, you begin to tap into something that is just vast and infinite and can't be held in mind. And the more you taste it, the more compelled you become to pursue more, to pursue it. And so in my teaching work, I was always emphasizing meditation. The way I taught it was as the art of conscious contentment or the practice of no problem. And essentially that just means sitting and allowing everything to be exactly as it is and being utterly content with whatever it is, no matter what, indefinitely. No desire for more. And it's paradoxical because, of course, we got into this because we desired more. And then we're asked to do a practice in which you are supposed to be perfectly satisfied with what is. And there's always going to be some part of your mind that goes, but wait a minute. The fact that I was dissatisfied is why I came in the first place. And now you're telling me to be satisfied. And the reason why the first step of release involves a profound degree of conscious contentment and satisfaction with the way things are is because our desire for more mistakenly leads to us trying to find that more in the familiar world. And we get very engaged in the process of trying to find more, trying to find fulfillment. And that may initially start in material ways. We try to find fulfillment through jobs or work or better circumstances or maybe relationships. All kinds of ways we're looking for fulfillment, and at some point we realize, we're not going to find it in there. And what we immediately want to do is then go, okay, I'm not going to find it in here, so I'm going to now try and find it over there in this thing called spirituality. But the thing called spirituality that we initially engage with is still part of all of this. It's still part of the familiar. And you can spend your whole life engaged in spiritual practices and spiritual pursuit and never leave the domain of the kind of familiar world of human identification. You can get very busy doing all kinds of things, but it just becomes another thing to be busy with. So before we can engage in any kind of active spiritual pursuit, we have to attain a certain degree of liberation. And that means letting go. And so for years, my teaching has emphasized meditation, conscious contentment, no problem. Just let go, let go, let go. And ultimately, let go so much, becomes so relaxed and so at peace and so undeniably content with everything and anything that could possibly happen that you begin to stop monitoring your own meditation. It doesn't matter anymore. Why bother paying attention to yourself meditating if you know you're not going to do anything anyway, no matter what? And so when you really know you are not going to respond to anything that arises in your practice, you actually can stop paying attention to what you're doing. And when you stop paying attention to what you're doing, you begin to forget yourself. You enter into a kind of flow state with being. And this is a process of self-forgetting, which ultimately leads to an abidance in pure awareness, or the awareness that is aware. And that's what a lot of my teaching work has been aimed toward, geared toward for years, is bringing people to a direct experience of the awareness that is aware, an abidance in pure awareness. And that, of course, leads to the recognition that that is who you are. You are the consciousness that is aware. And that is not exclusive to Jeff or John or Erica or Lorraine or anyone else. That's not exclusive to any individual. That is the awareness that is aware behind every individual. And that's when you understand that the awareness that is aware through me is exactly the same awareness that's aware through you. And we are one. We are literally one at that level. There is only one awareness. And as you've probably experienced and certainly know, that recognition of the awareness that is aware as the one and only true self, to say it's a game changer would be such a radical understatement of the fact. You know, that it just is a completely different universe than what you were in before. And so I was teaching meditation. I gathered people to work with me. I now have people who have worked with me for some years. And amidst that group of people that is engaged, about 3 years ago, I started to feel like a degree of conscious contentment had become the new normal. Not perfectly, not the same in every individual, but the center of gravity of that group, or of the work that I'm doing, the center of gravity was more in conscious contentment than anything else. So that creates a kind of stability. It creates a stable ground for more, to go further. And so at that point, I started thinking about, okay, what is more? Where is this further that we would go beyond conscious contentment? And in 2021, I published a book called The Path of Spiritual Breakthrough, which is basically my spiritual autobiography told through the most life-transforming spiritual breakthroughs that I had. And I wrote this book largely as a practice of self-exploration. I wanted to understand how I had come to the conclusions that I had come to, how I had come to the experience of life that I had come to. And I thought writing about it would be the perfect way to do that. And it turned out to be very valuable to me. So if you have the inclination to write your own spiritual autobiography, I would suggest writing an autobiography that is based on the experiences of transformation you've had, rather than circumstances or events, or even people that you met. But what were the transformative experiences that resulted? What were they like? What conclusions did you draw from them, and how did your life change as a result? And I started to see that the conscious contentment, for me, the inner freedom discovered in conscious contentment, which I had a dramatic experience of in 2001 that never left me, that really had become, in my personal path, that had become a foundation upon which all kinds of other experiences emerged. Kundalini awakenings, constant consciousness experiences, cosmic consciousness, all kinds of various things occurred over the next 10 to 20 years since. And they were all they were all on top of the conscious contentment. And I began to see that this kind of pursuit of higher breakthrough experiences was more possible now for many of the people that I work with. And I don't limit it to them. For many of us who've been doing practice and meditation for years, who have found at least a significant degree of equanimity in our inner self. Because without that, nothing really much is possible, right? If you're still inwardly very reactive, then you can't really engage in a transformative process, because your reactions to things are going to be mucking up the works. You're going to have fearful reactions or needy, desirous reactions. You're going to get pulled around by things that aren't necessarily aligned with your intention. But once there's a kind of, okay, I'm fine now, I am consciously content with the world the way it is, and from there you start to engage in practice, then that engagement can be clean. It can be free from reactivity. This is why I can see why in many of the traditions, and my background was largely in a Hindu tradition, but in the traditions they often say, don't get too involved in spiritual experiences until liberation, because before that you're likely to get all excited about that and forget about the freedom, forget about discovering the truth of who you are, because these other things are kind of more attractive and more fun, and they can easily distract you from the ultimate truth. But once some degree of the truth of who you are has been discovered, it does seem like there's an opportunity to explore higher dimensions of being without getting caught in them. And in doing so, you start to fill out more and more and more of who you are. So as I was thinking about all that, I was introduced to, or I started to get very interested in some work, particularly by Henri Corbin, a French Islamic scholar, and also a kind of soul development work was introduced to me by one of the members of the mystery school, a soul work developed by the poet Yeats, the Irish poet. And in reading Corbin's understanding of the Islamic tradition and the higher selves and the soul, and Yeats's soul work, I started to connect with the idea of a soul much more deeply than I ever had before. Now, that was all obviously an idea that was always around, but I really started to feel the reality of the soul. I really started to sense that part of me and the part of us that is on a journey bigger than this lifetime. And I started reading a lot of the Indian sage Sri Aurobindo and his conceptions of the psychic being. And all of that study, Corbin and Yeats and Sri Aurobindo, I guess the Yeats stuff came a little bit later, but the Corbin and Sri Aurobindo for sure, that all ended up being written into a book called The Soul's Journey for Wholeness. And this really outlines the idea of how deeper than this physical embodied birth, there is a soul. And that soul is on a long journey, multiple lifetimes, leading to reunion with the awareness that is aware, a kind of final reunion with Source. And I found this very compelling because I've been aware for a long time that different people seem to grow differently. I know there's a lot of teachers, and my teacher was one of those, who would like there to be one teaching that's perfect for everyone. And it just, reality defies that. This idea that there could be a singular path or a singular teacher who would be the perfect teacher for everyone. There isn't a lot of evidence to support that, at least not that I see. I see lots of different paths working for lots of different people, and lots of different paths not working for lots of other people. So it's very hard to figure out what any given individual needs. But it all started to make sense to me when I started to think about it in terms of not what you need as a human individual, but what your soul needs. Because the spiritual work I began to see is not for the human being, it's for the soul. It's for that deeper dimension of who you are. And where your soul is on its vast journey is going to be different than where this person's soul is. And there's no way really to know for sure what's necessary. Now, in the beginning of the path, it's true. I think, for instance, some form of conscious contentment, some form of inner freedom is necessary for pretty much everybody, right? Because that is the work of the earthbound self. That is the work that liberates the awareness from identification with just one aspect of itself. That's universally necessary. But beyond that, it gets harder and harder to predict anything. And at the very end, it's almost like by the very end of the path, we have to completely individuate how we operate spiritually. I like to use the analogy that, let's say we're all on the east coast of the US and we're walking to the west coast. But once we get to the west coast, we're going to be spread out anywhere from Washington State, down to Southern California. When we start the trip, everyone just needs to generally walk east. And therefore, we can kind of walk side by side for a while, as if we're all going to the same place. But when we get closer, you start getting towards the Rocky Mountains. Well, it's going to be time to start splitting up. The people going south need to start to head south. The people going north need to head north. The people in the middle need to stay going straight. And as you get closer and closer to the destination, well, this person's going to this part of Los Angeles, this person's going to that part of Los Angeles. We have to split up again. Even two people that are going to end up in the same apartment building, one's on the 3rd floor, one's on the 10th floor. The closer you get to that final completion, fulfillment of the path, the more individuated it becomes until it becomes exactly yours, exactly what you need. And so these are the things I was writing about in The Soul's Journey to Wholeness, and really exploring those ideas in relationship to some of these other thinkers. And when I finished The Soul's Journey to Wholeness, I started to feel, oh, I loved it. I love most of my books. I wouldn't write them if I wasn't going to love them, but I love this book. But I was feeling that it could really use some very direct instruction for practice, because it's a book that makes you want to practice because of the kind of spiritual ideas it shares and the worldview it shares, but it doesn't actually offer much by way of concrete suggestions for practice. And so I immediately started to write this book called Transdimensional Spirituality. And I just started to think, okay, well, what is the spiritual path that I've been working on, developing, practicing myself for all these years? Like, how would I write about that? How would I think about the path itself? Not the ideas, not the philosophy, although of course there's some of that included, but really the path. How does the path work? And that's what resulted in this book. And this really is a book that takes you through practices of release, of conscious contentment. And there's specific ways of practicing that, different ways. And often the way I've done it is I've put practices in, and then there's some suggestion for, okay, practice this until X, and then move on to the next practice. I really wanted to create a path of practice that could be followed with this book, which is something I have never done. So it goes through these practices of release, leading to self-forgetting and what I call luminous absorption, leading to that recognition of I am the awareness that is aware, the perfect bliss of release. But it also describes in detail the path of return. Because I know that most of us, having tasted the oneness, experienced the oneness, also feel compelled to bring the love and wisdom that abounds there back to earth. Now, not everyone feels that way. Some seem to feel that just that release into oneness is done for them. They don't feel a compulsion to return at all. I always have felt a desire to share what I discovered in those higher reaches. And I used to wonder about that. I used to wonder, like, was I wrong? Was there something? And then I realized, oh no, that's what my soul needs. See, this is how the idea of the soul has begun to shape my thinking. My soul needs to share this. And I know it because once I tried to stop, I decided that really I should just abide in blissful non-dual oneness, like the great masters of India supposedly did. But after about 3 weeks of not doing anything, I was going crazy. I thought, no, I have to share. I can't just experience stuff and not share it. I don't know why. It's just the way it is for me. So it was more of an expression of surrender for me to share than it was to stop sharing. Because to stop sharing, I had to make a lot of effort to stop it. But to share, that just seems to be what happens. For instance, writing. It just seems like one book happens after the next book, and I keep doing it. It would take more effort for me to stop than to keep going. And if I'm not actively writing something, I start to feel this buildup of energy that wants to write, that wants to share. So I wanted to include this return trip, what I have called the second surrender, which I'm now speaking about as transdimensional illumination. And it really has to do with having entered that causal realm of oneness, returning and exploring the multidimensional nature of reality. So that's why I called it transdimensional spirituality, because it's about leaving the three-dimensional world of the familiar, experiencing the pure awareness that exists beyond all dimensionality, and then exploring the multidimensional nature of who we are, finding ourselves and all of these different possible dimensions of being, which really is what I realized the breakthroughs of the path of spiritual breakthrough was all about. Those breakthroughs are breakthroughs into other dimensions of reality, other dimensions of possibility. And so I wrote about that, and I wrote about the third surrender of how do you share the things you find once you find them? Because we all know that's difficult. You can't just go up to anybody and start telling them about your higher dimensional experiences and expect them to be on board with you. So I talk about the process of sharing, the process of taking the inexplicable and creating forms that people can relate to, that can have an effect. And so through that whole cycle, which I sort of have a diagram of it as a U, where one releases into the causal realm and returns. There are detailed descriptions of 35 different practices that go, up into the release and back through the return to earth. And I feel very complete with this book in the sense that I feel like there's a lot here for me and anyone around me to work with for quite some time, to really explore all of those practices and the potential of this path to its fullest. So that's a little bit about the book. In March, I'll do a program that meets every day. My intention, I didn't know what to do. I thought, what am I going to do? How can I create a program that could even begin to contain all of this work? So I decided to do a 12-week program, which I think meets 5 days a week for 12 weeks and longer workshops on Saturdays, because I think with that much contact, real progress could be made. And this is, at the beginning of this, I said, this feels like a shift in my work. And it has to do with the fact that I really want to explore these higher dimensions with you, with people. I've always wanted to do that, but I feel like it's more possible now than it ever has been. And, what's always been exciting to me was for us to enter into higher states of consciousness and higher dimensions of reality together and establish ourselves there, create in each next higher dimension, establish ourselves there, essentially creating a new world in consciousness between us and stabilizing that until it becomes the next new normal. And then to explore whatever that foundation can bring us to. This is what I was doing in spiritual community for years before it collapsed. It's what's driven my whole life, really, is that from a very early age, like many of you, I was aware that reality was much bigger than this world, this familiar world around me, and I wanted to explore it. But I didn't want to explore it just alone. I wanted to explore it together. I wanted to do more than just peer into it. I wanted to establish a life there. And so, this book, I think, offers the perspectives and the guidance that will help establish that higher life. A couple of things I want to say about this book, which got very clear. See, the beautiful thing about writing for me is I get clear about things as I write about them. So it becomes a real practice in multiple ways. So as I'm writing about things, I come into aspects of my own thinking that feel confused, and then I have to go do research to figure it out. And part of this book, and one of the things I really wanted to come to terms with in a deeper way, is it's one of the problems with paths of release. Those paths of letting go, which are often called paths of transcendence, they can often easily become anti-life or anti-human. So the idea is the human is kind of the bad thing that we need to transcend into heaven. And that's not how it occurs to me. It never did occur to me that way. I've always been someone who loved my human life, and I love human beings. So I've never felt that human life or human beings was a problem. even though I felt compelled to discover myself as divinity. I didn't see that me discovering myself as divinity needed in any way to be in conflict with me loving myself as human. I just didn't have that problem. But I know that it is a problem, and often can be. In certain teachings, there's a lot of emphasis on ideas like ego death, which is an idea that's always bothered me. You know, as if you're killing yourself, and it just didn't feel right to me. But I also understood why traditionally it's often spoken about that way. But what really, the breakthrough I had writing The Soul's Journey to Wholeness was really incorporating the idea of the soul, and that helped me explain and understand a lot of things. The breakthrough I had writing Transdimensional Spirituality was recognizing that this human existence and the whole physical world that we as human beings live in, it's all a configuration of energy, ultimately. Now, this is very traditional, at least Eastern stuff. It's actually quite traditional in a lot of Western esoteric traditions as well. This is all a configuration of energy that shows up as physical stuff. And the spiritual path involves releasing our adherence, our attachment to the physical, so that we can enter and discover non-physical aspects of ourselves, soul aspects of ourselves. But what I realized is, this all started to make so much sense to me. The earthbound human self doesn't die. It doesn't go away. When our awareness, our attention shifts into the higher dimensions of reality, this earthbound existence doesn't go away. It doesn't cease to function. It just goes right along without us. It's fine. So when we are let's say you're driving your car and you're on a long drive. I just did a long drive, 5 hours, about a week ago. You're driving for 5 hours and you're just going along down the highway, and you look and you realize, oh, an hour and a half's gone by. Now, you have no memory of that hour and a half. It is unremembered time. You don't know what happened. You don't really remember anything. You were kind of whatever. You were just driving. You were, thought was happening, and maybe music was being listened to, or who knows what. But in the end, it feels like it was all kind of happening on autopilot. The car, it's almost like the human, you were driving on your own. Same thing with riding a bicycle, right? And riding a bicycle is the perfect example, I think. When you first start riding a bicycle and you're a young child, it's horrible. I have a friend who's just learning to ride a bicycle, and I was with them in a parking lot. It was painful to watch. That first time on a bike, it's all so wiggly, and the possibility of falling at any given second is ever present. And she has to pay incredible attention to the handlebars, to her pedals, to her position on she has no extra energy to give to anything except riding that bike. Now, once you've been riding for 10 years, it takes less time than that usually, but once you've been riding for a while, you just pick up the bike, hop on, and go. And then you can ride for 2 hours and never really think about riding. You don't think about your pedals. You don't think about the handlebars. You're just looking at the scenery. You're just looking at what you're passing. You're like, oh, that's a nice field. That's a beautiful landscape. You're just enjoying the world around you because you don't have to pay attention to riding the bike anymore. I think that's a much better analogy for transcendence than ego death. You know, you allow the human being, Jeff, to live Jeff's life. I don't need to be there watching it all the time. I don't need to be paying attention to everything Jeff's doing. He's pretty good at doing most things on his own. He gets up in the morning, he takes a shower, he makes breakfast, he goes to work, he does his, he's pretty much capable of living Jeff's life without a whole lot of supervision. Occasionally he gets into trouble, he comes up to a circumstance he hasn't faced before, or something challenging occurs and he calls me in. They're like, look, we need you. Conscious attention, we need that. It's like in the morning when you're going through your morning routine, everything's hunky-dory, just moving along. You're not really paying much attention, just doing what you do. Then, oops, you can't find your car keys. Darn, call in that conscious attention. We need consciousness back because we got to look for keys. We don't know how to do that on our own. Help us. Can you help us with that? And then you go back in your body and you find the keys. Once you get the keys, okay, then you say, okay, see you later. You go, autopilot continues. Flow. The human being largely lives in flow. We live largely in flow. I believe, so let me finish that thought. So when we transcend into higher dimensions, we allow our human body, our humanness, to live in flow without excessive self-consciousness. And we allow our attention to move beyond this realm into the higher dimensions of being, knowing that if we're needed, we'll be called back. That being said, this is why it's so important to have your life work, your human life. Because if your life is messy, if it's in constant crisis, it's never going to leave you alone. It's going to keep needing you to come back to deal with stuff. But if you can make your life work so that you're whatever, you have a sustainable existence, you have undramatic, non-problematic relationships, you make your life work, that's going to give you the freedom to explore higher dimensions. And you just allow this human existence to continue. So those practices of conscious contentment, on the one hand, they allow us to release. But over time, the practice of conscious contentment actually begins to affect the choices that we make in life, because we begin to develop a preference for contentment. We begin to want to create a life which tends toward contentment. No life is perfect. There's always going to be moments where we are called back. But some lives are much more peaceful and tranquil than others, and we start to develop a desire for that. And the more we attain a life that works, that's non-problematic, that doesn't require our conscious intervention all the time, the freer we are to explore the higher dimensions of our being. And so the quality of our human life, far from wanting it to be dead, we actually want it to be good. A good human life is the right foundation for higher spiritual exploration. And the last thought I want to share with you is that I began to see, writing this book, that the lack, and I think we all know this, I think intuitively we all know it. We all feel like the lack of a spiritual foundation for life, the lack of spirituality generally in particularly Western culture is a important cause, a significant cause of a lot of the human problems and dilemmas that I've seen. This was part of what motivated me to live a spiritual life 30 years ago, is I was doing activist work and realized that without a shift in consciousness, all the activist work in the world wasn't really going to ultimately be enough, because it's all landing in the same consciousness that created the problems in the first place. But beyond that, in writing this book, I began to see that without an active spiritual aspect of life, right? Without a place for our attention to go to explore higher possibilities beyond this world, all of that attention that would go there, that in my life and in your life, I'm sure, a lot of your extra attention goes into the exploration of spirit, a deeper exploration of life and meaningfulness. But if that's not in your life, if you don't have an avenue for that in life, all that attention just gets turned back on your human life and results in kind of excess self-consciousness. And I started to, and I've always realized this, but I really started to think about how generally in life, many of the people who come to want to learn meditation from me, they are excessively over-focused on all the minutia of their life. They worry about every little thing that happens, things that are literally not really in their control, don't ultimately matter that much, and also other things which matter a lot, but there's so much pressure of self-analysis and self-concern and attention on one's life. And I thought, if they had something magnificent that they were busy exploring, it would probably take a lot of pressure off their life. Their life wouldn't have to be the place where all of their extra attention went to all the time. They could be exploring something. And I think intuitively we all know that this is true. And I feel that it's potentially a great benefit to many people to find a way, and the challenge in our society is it's not really completely mainstream acceptable to be exploring higher dimensions of reality. And you meet someone randomly in the grocery store and they say, "Hey, what are you doing today?" "Oh, I'm going to be busy exploring higher dimensions of reality." That'll probably be the last conversation you have with that person. Unless they're like you, and then you'll have a best friend. But there's not a lot of social acceptance around these things. So here, one of the reasons we like being here, and even in this Zoom format, and we'd even like it better if we were together. But one of the reasons we like it here is because, these are people who, there is a social contract that says this is valuable. There is a social contract that says we are more than just this physical body. And there are higher dimensions of our being, and they are the most magnificent thing worth exploring. And you don't have to be apologetic about that, or shy about it, or hesitant about it. You can be completely open about it, and it's acceptable. So, as I said, I wanted to introduce to you my new book, Transdimensional Spirituality. There'll be a 12-week course starting in March that goes through the practices and that will give us the opportunity to explore them together. And I'm just really excited about it. Some books that I write feel like the most significant book I've ever written. Others don't. Some of them feel like side projects that just I love. And I don't know if anybody else is going to read. But some of them feel very significant. And this is one that feels very significant. And it feels significant in a different way because of the emphasis on practice. And because this is the first book that I've written that I really feel I can honestly say, this is a book not primarily to read, but to work with. And that's what I wanted to create, was a book to work with, because I don't actually have something like that. So thank you so much. Bye, everyone.